Halo, tes. Ini aku lagi so I boost up the gitu ya Zaki. Jadi aku naikin resolusinya, nggak tahu nih berhasil atau enggak. Coba ya. Coba kita lihat. Teng 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 teng. Sekarang jam setengah 11 dan aku baru mau belajar. Blok anjing dari tadi ngapain aja. Baru pulang, guys. Patah ya. Rugi rugi rugi. Apakah resolusinya naik? Semoga naik. Ya, nggak naik. Ih, naik. Berarti berhasil. Dari kemarin aku salah pengaturan cuma 10. Kok terang kali? Dari kemarin cuma salah satu settingan guys, makanya nggak naik-naik resolusi. Tapi kalau kayak gini kuotaku yang habis ya. Ini kenapa jadi terang banget? Kayak belajar. Wah, ini kenapa terang kali, weh? The fuck? Oke. Wah, kipasnya nggak ganggu ya. Oke, semoga kita belajar. And I don't want the world just to see me. Ya, kita belajar, belajar. Kita belajar, kita belajar. Ini kameranya kenapa terang banget? Ya, tapi aku mau beres-beres dulu. Berantakan sangat, berantakan sangat, berantakan sangat, berantakan sangat. Cih, cih. Nah, tapi kau pilih sahabatku, ya, namun kau tahu cinta tak bisa dipaksakan. Jangan kau pilih dia. Oke, minum belum ready, kita kasih dulu minum ready. Kamu yang kasih tinggal, kasih kasih minum. Ah, shit. Ya, oke, mari kita belajar. Ah, shit. Belajar apa bang? Belajar apa bang? Oke guys, jadi selanjutnya kita bakal eh kok panas ya tiba-tiba. Namun kau pilih sahabatku dilema. Namun kau tahu cinta tak bisa dipaksakan. Jangan kau pilih dia, pilih aku lah, pilihlah aku. Mencintai lebih dari dia. Namun apa? Namun kau tahu. Bunda nelpon. Kok nggak masuk sih notifnya? Oh, biarkan ku genggam erat. Yes, you're here with me. Halo. Enggak. Masih. Masih. Senin masuk. Malah. Enggak lah. Iya. Mimi. Instruction to capstone project. What is capstone project? What are capstone project? The goal of this work is to create web applications using Node.js, Express, and AGS, and the applications will allow users to create and Box posts. Posts will not persist between sessions, as no database will be used in these versions of the application. Styling will be an important aspect of this work to ensure a good user experience. Example. Just viewing the homepage show allow the users to view.
Hey guys, in this section will be the first time you will be creating a capstone project. So before we get started, I want to quickly
Salam. Baik. Yuk. Halo, tes. Nih, mari kita lanjut. Di sini ada yang namanya capstone projects and there is an example here. Delivers one node projects from the functions the websites, including at least one EGS file of the structure of the website and Ini kita disuruh bikin nih. Oh, ini.
Tell you what exactly are the Hey guys, in this section will be the first time you will be creating a capstone project. So before we get started, I want to quickly tell you what exactly are the capstone projects and why they're so important in your journey of becoming a web developer. As a professional web developer, the most important thing I want to know about you is what you have done. Many web developers, for example, in this case, Matt Farley, a professional web developer and designer, on his personal website, you'll be able to see his recent work. And this shows off the projects that he's worked on, the clients he's worked with, and also it means that anybody who's looking to hire him will be able to see exactly what he's made of. This is what we are building towards. Now, whenever I interview web developers or other programmers for any sort of job, one of the most important thing I look for is their portfolio. What have they built? What does their code look like? What are they able to do? And this is a really important step in your evolution as a developer. You need to be able to show people what you're capable of, and what better way than to start building a portfolio. Previously, you already come across GitHub, and hopefully you've already got an account on there. And this is where we're going to be starting our portfolio, just like any other professional developer. On your profile in GitHub, you will be able to pin and highlight some of the projects that you've built. And this is where your portfolio is going to start to evolve. Now, another really neat thing about GitHub is you can see a developer's activity level. You can see how often they've been uploading stuff to GitHub as a proxy for how often they're working and writing code. So this is another great way of telling how active a programmer is and how much they're practicing and polishing their skills. In the coming lessons, you're going to see an instruction for the capstone project. And the great thing about these capstone projects is I've created them so that they are perfectly suited for your current level. I know exactly what you've learned because I've just taught it to you, and the project specifications reflect this. So it should be doable at your level. Now, that doesn't mean it's not hard. There will be difficulties that you'll encounter, and you will have things that you might want to look up on the internet. Maybe you'll need to look through the docs, and you'll probably struggle at some point along the way. That is the idea of the capstone projects. But in addition, in the instructions, you'll always see an example website that I've created to show you what it is you're aiming for. Now, the important thing here is you don't just straight up copy the example website, because remember, this course is taken by millions of people across the entire web. And I've often seen people apply to jobs under my friend startups or other situations where I've seen in their portfolio project that are clearly from a tutorial. And I know that because they're one of my tutorials. So keep this in mind when you're building your capstone project. And the reason why these capstone projects can be added to your portfolio is because it's going to be entirely your work. The specifications are there as if you're a professional developer getting the instructions from your clients. So ideally, everyone's work will be completely different. And unlike the course projects where I provide solution code, where I provide walkthrough videos, where we go through every part of the project in detail together, I give you the designs to create it, I show you exactly what it needs to look like, all the images and files that you require in order to build it. The capstone projects are a different concept. And the easiest way to imagine is you've now graduated from Web Developer Bootcamp and you're now ready to take on a client. Your client is going to give you a specification for what you need to create, and you're going to create it as a professional. No copying of other people's code and no instructor to lean on. And hopefully through these capstone projects, you'll see your own personal evolution. What you're able to build at capstone 1 is going to be very different from capstone 6 and so on. And this is a great way of getting used to working as a professional developer. Now, if you don't ever want to get a job as a developer, then feel free to skip this module entirely and continue learning. It's only feel free to skip this module entirely and continue learning. It's only useful if you find it useful. It's not for my benefit. But I do think that it's really important to get out of what's called tutorial hell, where you are relying heavily on tutorials. You need to be able to feel the struggle and to do things by yourself in order to evolve and get better as a programmer and as a developer. All right, enough said. It's time to move on to the next lesson and take a look at the instructions for your first capstone project. I hope you enjoy it, and be sure to share your good work in the Q&A once you're done.
Ini apaan, Ji? Perlu perlu nggak ya aku ada ini sekarang? Aku cuman sekarang ini fokus utama aku back end, belajar back endnya dulu, cuy. Kemarin itu aku udah selesai belajar sebenarnya, tapi di 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 course yang kali itu agak beda gitu. Ada materi tambahan kayak EJS. Kalau di coding kemarin aku nggak belajar itu. Hmm, apa aku fokus ke materi aja dulu ya. Nanti kalau misalnya memang udah selesai gitu, baru nanti aku bakal bangun project. Masalahnya ini aku udah agak lupa. Front end ini aku udah agak lupa kayak HTML, CSS. Kalau kemarin kan lancar banget nih. Sekarang apa aku fokus ke back end aja dulu ya? Gimana ya? Kayak aku fokus ke back end dulu sih. Mm-mm. Masalahnya aku kemarin punya ini kan, punya apa? Punya goalnya itu kayak ngepahamin back end dan database-nya ini. Tapi untuk masalah yang front end-nya nanti itu sebenarnya tentang menggali ingatan aja. Kalau misalnya kan aku udah bisa tuh kemarin kayak ngebangun gitu bla bla bla. Kalau misalnya aku ngebangun ingatannya aja itu sebenarnya bisa sih nanti, tapi jangan sekarang deh. Kayaknya itu nanti pas ketika aku udah memahami seluruh konsepnya itu kayak how to integrate it with database. Aku udah nonton juga itu, tapi aku masih belum tahu cara ngehubunginnya. Kayaknya aku harus selesai ini dulu. Coba ya kita lihat. Di sini ada API. Ini aku sebenarnya udah belajar, tapi aku mau nonton versi yang dari Udemy ini. Kalau dari decoding aku udah belajar. Nah ini nih database SQL, PostgreSQL, Capstone Project. Nah React.js-nya aku mau belajar. Kayaknya ini nanti dulu ya, kita simpan deh. Kita simpan ya. Capstone Project ya, aku catat. Kita simpan aja dulu. Nanti aku bikin Capstone Project, Capstone Project. Oh iya, aku baru inget. Gimana untuk peserta PSSK? Ini yang kompeten ini ngeliatnya di mana ya? Eh, BNSP, PS. Namun kau pilih. Di sini tuh aku harus ngeprint belangko tanda terima sertifikat, belangko surat pernyataan persetujuan penggunaan sertifikat, fotokopi KTM, fotokopi KTP. Bisa lah ini ya. Fotokopi KTM, fotokopi KTP, easy lah. Kalau misalnya tanda terima sertifikat tuh yang ini. Data pribadi, data sertifikat, surat kuasa pengambilan sertifikat, belangko tanda terima sertifikat apa sih? Tanda terima sama persetujuan. Kalau ini apa? Kuasa pengambilan. Kita isi aja. Dan pengambilannya itu dimulai 12 Agustus minggu depan. Nice, guys. Oke, berarti loginnya di mana sih? Aku lupa lah. Kamu yang kasih tinggal, kasih kasih tinggal. Hmm, Linknya yang mana ya? Bukan ini, coy. B, kira-kira. N. Oh ini ya. Bukan. Apa ya kemarin linknya? Link loginnya itu loh, aku lupa. Alamat, cowok. Apa ya link loginnya kemarin? Nah ini nih, siap kompeten. Aduh, apa ya kemarin? Oh, ya. Yeay, kompeten. Yeay, ambil sertifikat. Yeay. Let's go. Kita ambil sertifikat, guys. Finally, BNSP sertifikat. Finally. Um, wait. Um, and until the Lord just see me, I think that I understand. And everything such to be broken. I just want you to know who I am. Oke, berarti sekarang kita lanjut ke ini ya, materi. Apa nih materi? GitHub and ini aku udah belajar yang git-git ini. Gak usah dulu lah. Ini aku udah belajar, bisa lah. Nih, aku mau lanjut belajar API ini sih. Terus nanti caption caption project lagi. Nah, ini baru masuk ke database. Gas. Berarti sekarang kita ke API ini.
Hey guys, in this
Aduh, kok aku nggak fokus ya? Bentar kan. Kok aku nggak fokus ya? Terlalu kenyang coy. Kacamata gue mana kacamata gue? Nggak fokus ya? Kenapa nih? Ada yang ganggu pikiran tapi nggak tahu apa. Nggak fokus. Lu nggak fokus ya? Bentar. Nggak fokus sih. Susah nih. Belum masuk zona nih, belum masuk zona. Nanti targetnya kayak gini. Aku nggak tahu nih belajar sampai jam berapa. Kemungkinan paling lama sampai jam 1. Enggak, intinya sebisanya lah. Kan nanti aku nih belajar API ya. API. Terus nanti belajar juga dengan buat your own API. Setelah itu aku nanti akan masuk ke database. Nah, di database ini kemarin aku udah belajar, tapi kayaknya aku bakal nonton ulang. Tapi satset aja, gitu-gitu gitu. Terus nanti kita lihat gimana, apakah di Postgres SQL aku apa benar-benar bakal bisa paham. Soalnya kemarin pas aku nonton database masih agak bingung ya, karena belum belajar AJS. Tapi sekarang aku udah belajar AJS. Seharusnya bisa lebih paham. Berarti inti kita jalanin aja dulu. Kita lihat nanti sampai mana gitu. Oke, setidaknya gitu dulu ya. Setidaknya gitu dulu. Chill dulu. Santai-santai. Kita kayak gitu. Terus nanti kita bisa inti ikutin aja terus ngelakuin sebisanya. Ini gara-gara kopi 25.000 ini cok nggak fokus aku tuh. Apa nih? Oke, kita dengerin satu lagu dulu biar fokus. Eh, nanti ini copyright. Mampus lah. Jaringannya putus. Udah mulai becok. Ya, jaringannya jelek ya. Kok 71 kilobyte gitu. Udah mulai becok jaringannya. Lumayan banget loh. Belajar dasar manajemen proyek, belajar dasar AI, data science. Lumayan nih data science and AI. Oh, di coding ada sertifikasi kompetensi. I just know it. Ini jaringannya telur, cok. Lag banget. Ah, mana sih? Ini back end academy kemarin nih yang aku lagi belajar dan aku udah selesai. Ini udah selesai. Ini yang baru nih. Nanti kita bakal belajar ini nih. Ini sangat amat 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 lumayan. Ini aku mau daftar. Selamat, kamu telah terdaftar pada program. Silakan cek email tertentu sebelum kamu juga dapat langsung belajar kelas. Belajar sekarang. Cek email. Eh, terus mana? Mana? Ini. Kok nggak ada? Kok LinkedIn? Shit. Mana sih? Nggak ada loh. Mana? Selamat, kamu telah terdaftar pada program. Silakan cek email terdaftar untuk kamu langsung belajar di kelas. Tapi mana? Mana course-nya? Mana data science-nya? Ini nge-lag atau gimana sih? Di email pun juga nggak ada. Ini aku yang pakai email apa ya? Emang ada Excel? Tuh nggak ada loh. Ngelek kah? Tuh malah disuruh berlangganan. Tuh malah disuruh berlangganan. Gak jelas, Cok. Apa sih? Ini yang error jaringan aku atau di coding nih? Sumpah jaringannya ngelek kali, Cok. Sumpah ini ngelek kali sih. Tuh, error jing. Tapi ini lumayan kali loh beasiswanya. Sampai data science, ada AI sama data science sih. Bagus sekali untuk belajar basic. Tuh malah disuruh langganan. Asyuk. Daftar sekarang. Apanya, Cok? Email, 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 email. Pengaturan. Email aku apa ya? Mana email, Cok? Nih, benar kok email aku. Tapi nggak ada masuk di email. Kayaknya error nih. Tuh, nggak ada. Spam. Nggak jelas, nggak jelas. Nggak jelas, nggak jelas. Juga nggak jelas. Share area lah, email, Cok. Teman kau gila. Cok, gak jadi-jadi aku belajar, Cok, gara-gara di coding ini, ya Allah. Ini kenapa sih? Orang mau daftar. Mahasiswa aktif perguruan tinggi memiliki komputer, daftar. Tuh, selamat kamu telah terdaftar. Apa yang terdaftar? Kagak jelas. Kocak. Gak ada UGM ya? Oh, ada. Daftar. Nggak mau ya. Apa karena tahun kemarin udah daftar ya? Nggak mau ya. Udah, biar dulu nanti aku urus pendaftaran sampai tanggal berapa ya? Tai emang. Emang mau belajar.
This module that we're about to begin, we're going to Hey guys, in this module that we're about to begin, we're going to be learning all about APIs, the technology that powers communication between software on the internet. What is an API? Well, it stands for an application programming interface. And it's essentially a set of rules and protocols that define how different software can interact with each other. Now, what does that mean in real life? I remember reading an article by Mark Andreessen, the founder of interact with each other. Now, what does that mean in real life? I remember reading an article by Mark Andreessen, the founder of A12Z, one of the most famous venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. And I remember him writing an article about why software is eating the world. And it's still incredibly relevant in today's day and age. But one of the things that he started out was the statement that software is eating the world. And he reflects on the fact that books are now bought on Amazon instead of bookstores, TV has been taken over by Netflix, and so on and so forth. And essentially the whole world runs on software. But one of the things you have to think about with so many different pieces of software existing out there on the internet or on your computer or on different places or even in your fridge, you have to think about the communication between those pieces of software. Let's say we had a program called Program A and we had another one called Program B. If we wanted Program A and Program B to talk to each other because they provide different pieces of functionality and we want them to work together, then we would need them to be able to communicate to each other. But unfortunately, in our case, Program A speaks Chinese and Program B speaks Japanese. So what can we do for them to be able to interact with each other? Well, we would need an interface in between these two programs so that they know how to interact with each other through this bridge in the middle. And that is essentially what an API does. It bridges the communication between different pieces of software. Now, let's take some concrete examples. Maybe you're building a diary website where the user can jot down an entry for each day in their life. In addition to all the text that they get to write, you also want to add a little icon at the beginning of each entry that shows the weather for that day. You can, of course, get the user to look it up and pick a weather icon, but it's much better if this was automated. Now, while you're building a website, you look around and you see that there is a company called Open Weather that stores and captures weather data, and they have that weather data available in their database. And it's updated frequently and it's available for all the locations in the world. And you think, wow, perfect. That's exactly what I need. I need to be able to talk to these servers to bring their weather data into my website. So how do you do that? You don't know what their database is written in. It could be some sort of programming language you've never heard of. You don't know how to access their backend servers. You don't know what the rules are that governs those servers. You basically have absolutely no idea of how this website or their data storage works. And that is when the API comes in to save you. So in this case, Open Weather creates an API that tells you how you can interact with their services. If you want data from them, then there are these and these things that you can access. For example, if you pass in the latitude and longitude of the location you're interested in, well, they can give you the weather for that location. They can tell you how that weather is structured. For example, maybe there is something called temperature that gives you the temperature in degrees Celsius. Maybe there is a icon for the weather type. So maybe it would be cloudy that you would get back. All you have to do then is to make a request from your website through this API to say, well, these are the things that I want. And because you now have this interface to know how to interact with their services, you're able to get this data back and populate it into your website. Now, this is almost a simpler problem because essentially what you're doing is you're making a GET request to get some data from OpenWeatherMap. And in the response, they send back some data. And the API simply tells you how you can make these requests and how the data that's coming back is structured. Now, let's think about a different problem. Let's say that you want to have a website where you want to let people sign up for your newsletter. You're writing a newsletter every week and you want all of your fans and all of your friends to sign up to this newsletter. Also, you might have an email collection box. But where does that get stored? Well, what if you wanted to send your email using MailChimp and you want to be able to send your box, but sign up to this new, and you want all of your fans and all of your friends to sign up to this newsletter. Also, you might have an email collection box, but where does that get stored? Well, what if you wanted to send your email using MailChimp and you want to be able to send this email that you collect each time on your website into a database on your MailChimp account? How would you do this? Well, again, through an API. MailChimp could define an API that tells you how you should structure your post requests so that you can send over the data to your email database on your MailChimp account, and they, in turn, can respond with whether if the process was successful or if there were errors. So in this case, the MailChimp API defines a structure for the data you want to send, and also it tells you what kind of responses you can expect in which kind of situations. Now, let's take a look at an even more extreme example. Let's say you want to build a program on your computer where you can send a tweet over to a plant that you have at home, where every time you tweet at your plant account, then you've got some sort of Arduino or IoT devices that's going to water your plant. So how would this work? Again, through an API. You could create an API for your hardware, in this case, the watering device, and you could get it to listen for requests coming through the internet from your program. And when you monitor the account of your cacti or other plant, when it sends a request to a particular path, say water, and when it sees that request, then it's going to start watering your little plant and releasing the valve that allows your plant to live, even if you just decided that you no longer want to live in a cold climate and you want to go and move halfway across the world. At least your plant is taken care of. And an example of a response from this API could be how much water was released, or what is the moisture content of the soil, and so on and so forth. So I've shown you 3 different examples of APIs in use in very different situations. And there are many, many other situations, but essentially what they have in common is the fact that they are an interface between 2 pieces of software. And by defining a protocol or a set of rules that you can follow, then the different pieces of software know how to interact with each other and what they should expect when they do interact with the other service. You might have heard of some of the different types of APIs, such as GraphQL, SOAP, REST, gRPC, and a whole bunch more. Essentially, what these are is they are architectural styles. Just as maybe you would create a house and you decide that you wanted, for some reason, ionic columns in the front of your house. This is an architectural style, right? And this is how you decide to design your home. But somebody else might decide that they want to build their house with a different type of column. Maybe they want to have Doric columns that have these fancy little squiggles at the top. And it looks super duper fancy, and they want to impress all of their neighbors with these beautiful columns. And I've definitely seen houses that look like this. They're pretty crazy, but this is a different architectural style. So similarly, we've got different architectural styles for creating an API, because essentially an API is just a set of rules, and they each decide different rule sets for creating APIs. Now, which one do we choose to learn, or do we learn all of them and spend our entire life trying out all the different types of APIs? No. As always, my belief in terms of learning is just-in-time learning. So learn what you need in the moment, because that is the best way that you're going to get to grips with it, because you have a strong motivation. In our case, when it comes to web development, there is one type of API that rules them all, and it is the REST API. This is the most popular, most commonly used, and most important type of API to know if you are going to work with the web. What is a RESTful API? It's not APIs that make you sleepy. It's APIs that follow a particular set of rules. But the most important rule of them all is the fact that you use the HTTP protocol to interact with the API. And lucky for us, we've already learned about all of these HTTP protocols: get, post, put, patch, and delete. If you skipped over past lessons, search through the curriculum and take a look back at the different HTTP protocols. So what does this mean for us? It means that we've already got a leg up on understanding how REST works and how to use it in order to make requests and access different APIs. So now let's go ahead and try an exercise where we make a request to an API and get some piece of information back. We're not going to be building a website for this API. We're going to interact with it using Postman. And let me set the scene here. You're staring at the night sky. It's a beautiful, cloudless night. And you see thousands upon thousands of stars in the sky. And you can see the Milky Way. And it's just incredibly beautiful. Now you see these flashes of light going across the sky. And you say to your companion, wow, it's a shooting star. And your companion tells you, actually, it's probably a satellite. And today, at any given moment, when you look at the night sky and you see something that moves, it's most likely to be a satellite. Now, one of the most famous satellites is the ISS, the International Space Station. And luckily for us, there is an API called Where the ISS At that gives you real-time ISS location, so that the next time when you look up at the night sky and you see some sort of object moving like it's a shooting star, you can check to see if it's the International Space Station and if there's actually astronauts right above your head floating around eating space food. When you look at the documentation for an API, such as the one for Where the ISS At, you will see it almost looks a bit like a menu. It tells you what is the URL that you need to access in order to interact with the API, and it tells you what kind of response you can expect to get back. And it gives you a little bit of data on each of these endpoints, and depending on what it is you want from the API, you can figure out by looking at the database how you should access it. When we access an API, such as one like this, where we're just getting some data back, such as the latitude and longitude of the ISS, then we can simply make a GET request to the URL that they specify. You can imagine our API documentation like a lunch menu, where you pick, what do I want? Well, I want some bread and I want some calamari. And then you make the request using HTTP. And depending on the type of request, maybe you need to make a post request, or maybe you need to make a GET request. Once you've looked through the menu of options, you can decide what you need. In our case, what we're trying to do is we're going to locate the live location of the International Space Station. That's the goal. And once you've located it using the API, you're going to check the latitude and longitude, and you're going to type it in to Google Maps. The first number that comes is latitude and the second is longitude, and you separate them with a single comma, such as how I've written it over here. And you can paste that into the search bar in Google Maps. And Google Map will drop a pin on the location that is the live location of the International Space Station. So that's pretty cool, and that's the goal of this exercise. Open up Postman and take a look at the API documentation for where the ISS is at this URL location, and see if you can figure out how to make a GET request in order to get the live latitude and longitude of the ISS. Pause the video, give this a go.
Make an API request using source and get the latitude and longitude of the ISS specific coordinate. Jim disuruh apa tadi? Where is the ISS? Gimana sih webnya? Where is the ISS? Where is the? Kok nggak ada? Where the ISS? Oh ini. Action for response. Terus cara nge-requestnya gimana? Longitude, latitude, and longitude. Yang ini berarti. Oh gini. Mungkinkah kita kan gak bisa pun, gak bisa kocak. Get, ini get request kan? Ku genggam. Bisa cok. Aku salah ketik. Oh anjay, latitude, longitude. Udah dapat terus. And sekarang kita buka di Google Maps. Mungkinkah kita kan selalu bersama? Walau terbentang jarak antara kita. Biarkan. Where is this? What the fuck? What the fuck? Ini siapa bujang? Lah lagu. The fuck?
All right, let's run through the solution together. When you take a look at the documentation, as I mentioned, it looks a bit like a menu. Now, we want to read through the menu to see what we're going to get. Are we going to get salad or are we going to get bacon? It's very important because it would be really sad if you ordered bacon and you got salad instead. If we take a look
Oh, jadi kayak gitu cara memanfaatkan Open API ya. Okay.
at the different endpoints that we've got here, one will show us the different satellites that they track.
So we just need use get, post, or some or other request. Oh gitu. Berarti kalau untuk ngedapetin data itu tinggal get ya.
This is not so interesting because in the future they want to track lots of different satellites, but right now apparently they only have the International Space Station that's tracked. This is not the endpoint that we want. Let's take a look at the next one. It says that it returns the position, velocity, and other related information about a particular satellite. And in order to get hold of that data, you have to give it the ID of the satellite that you want. And given they only have one satellite, which is the ISS, they tell you what is the ID of that satellite. And they have an example where they've shown you how to access that particular API endpoint using this URL. And they also show you what is the structure of the data that you can expect to get back. And if we take a look here, it has the most important pieces of information that we want, latitude and longitude. So we're now ready to go ahead and make this request using Postman. If you remember from before, Postman is a really useful tool for us to be able to make HTTP requests without needing to have a front end or a back end. Instead of having to create a website and then make these requests and install Express and all of that, we can avoid all of it when we want to test a particular request. We know that we want to get some data, so we're going to use a GET request, and we're going to copy the example resource URL in here to hit up this particular endpoint, which is /satellites / the ID of the satellite. The ID of the ISS is 25544 on this API, and if I go ahead and hit send, then it's going to send that request and return me some live data. Now we've got the important pieces of information that we're after, the latitude and longitude, and we can go into Google Maps and paste in the data that we got back. Going into Postman, let's go ahead and copy our latitude, paste that in, add a comma, and then paste in the longitude, and make sure if there are any negative signs in front of any of those numbers that you copy those as well. Now that we've got our latitude and longitude structured for Google to be able to know where it is, let's hit enter and let Google find us where the ISS is at. So it seems right now it's some point in the North Pacific Ocean, somewhere between Hawaii and Mexico. If you happen to be right around here in a boat somewhere and you look up, you're probably looking up at the ISS. Now, if when you type in your latitude and longitude it doesn't work, you can check out this Google support article where they tell you how to structure your coordinates and the different types of structures that are accepted and what correct and incorrect coordinates look like. You can Google for this by searching for discover coordinates or search by latitude and longitude from Google Maps, but hopefully you've managed to figure out where is the live location of the ISS at the current time point for you. Hopefully you had fun learning a brief bit about APIs and giving it a quick go. In the next lesson, we're going to dive in deeper and learn about more complex types of API requests, and we're also going to see how we can make these different requests using our web server. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Hey guys, welcome to...
Wait.
To another lesson on APIs. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about how to format your API requests. And by the end of the lesson, you will understand what are endpoints, what are path parameters, what are query parameters, and how you can format and change your API requests. What we've seen so far is we've built front ends for our websites and we've built back ends for our websites, and they can interact with each other through requests and responses. Our front end might make a GET request to our back end, and in return, for example, you want to open a different web page. So then you would make a GET request and your server would send back some response with some code, with some data. Maybe that can go into your EJS file and be displayed to the user. This, if you think about it, is effectively hitting up a private API. Now, the reason why it's private is because you don't document it for other people to use. Your server is exclusively serving your own front end and not somebody else. However, if somebody else knew how your server was structured and tried to hit it up, that would be tapping into a private API. And people do, in fact, do this if there is some sort of strong reason to do that. Now, normally, however, what you're interested in doing is getting your server to talk to somebody else's server and get some data or do something and interact with that server in some sort of way. And this is again done using requests and responses, but this time it's done via a public API. And it's public because this particular server has allowed this kind of behavior. So they've probably documented how to use their public API. They've exposed certain parts of their server to anybody who wants to request it. And that is what we're learning all about in this module, how to use public APIs. Now, we've created an API for you, which is called the board API, and it contains activities that you can do when you're bored, and it's got a whole bunch of data on what you could do, how many participants it requires, if it's free or if it costs something, but you can take a look at the documentation by going to board-api.appbury.com. And once you head over to the homepage of this API, you will see some documentation, and it shows you all the things that you can do with this public API. And it shows you all the things that you can do with this public API. The first thing I want to introduce you to when it comes to structuring your requests to these APIs is something called the API endpoint. Normally, you will have a base URL, something.com, and then you'll have a / and an endpoint. This endpoint can be different for different purposes. For example, in our board API, there is a / random endpoint where you can get hold of random activities when you're bored. There is a / filter endpoint when you want to filter the activities based on some sort of criteria. And the endpoint is basically a different route on the API provider's server. And in the documentation, they will usually give you an example of which endpoints you can use and what is the purpose of that endpoint. Let's go ahead and try an exercise on Postman. I want you to hit up the random endpoint on the board API, and I want you to try and get hold of a random activity each time you make that GET request. Pause the video, take a look at the documentation for the board API, and
Kok couldn't send request? Why? Aku nggak mau.
and see if you can get hold of a random activity through Postman.
Oh. Make a to-do list for your week. Keren, keren.
All right, so the first place to start with any API is reading through the documentation. We know that we're trying to get hold of a random activity, and the documentation tells us this is what an example request would look like. It would be the full path of the API, and then there is the endpoint. It's / random, and it even tells us what we can expect to get back when we make that request. Let's open up Postman and create a new HTTP request. Now, we want to make a GET request to match up with the method in the documentation, but also we know we're trying to get hold of a resource. Let's go ahead and copy the URL This is the base URL and this is the endpoint. And that's pretty much all we have to do in order to hit it up. Let's hit send and send our request to the board API. All right, so it tells us to watch a Khan Academy lecture on a subject of your choosing. This is an education type of activity, only requires one person. It's totally free to do. And there's even a link that's provided. So that's pretty cool. And you can keep sending requests to this API. But notice that with most
Khan Academy itu apa sih? Kok aku sering dengar sih Khan Academy. Education company.
public APIs that don't require authentication, there's usually some method to prevent people from abusing the resource. So in our case, we've added a rate limit so that you can only make 100 requests every 15 minutes. And after you've used up those requests, you'll have to wait for 15 minutes. So while you're testing the API, 100 should be more than enough to complete all the activities in this lesson, but just be aware of that. And if you see a response where it says you've made too many requests, you'll know what's happened and you'll know that you just have to wait a little bit. The next aspect of structuring a request is something called query parameters. We've already seen the endpoint comes at the end of the base URL. So this is the base URL, this is the endpoint. And then afterwards, we can add a little question mark to say that we are adding a query now to the end of this request. You start off all the queries with a question mark, and then it's basically just a key value pair, where this is the name of the query, and then you have an equal sign, and then you provide the value for that query. And it's basically a way to put a key value pair into the URL when you want to provide some additional information or some parameters to a request. Normally, when you're hitting up an API, they're used for filtering, sorting, searching. And you can even have multiple query parameters by simply adding an ampersand after the first query. So remember, very important thing is in order to begin your first query, you need a question mark, and then you have your key value pair. And then after the first pair, if you want to add more queries, you tag them on starting with an ampersand. So for example, this is query number 1, query and value, query number 2, query and value. If I wanted to add a third one, I would add another ampersand and then add my query 3 and then its value. And these all just get tagged on to the end of the URL. So let's try doing that in Postman. If you take a look at the board API and you scroll down, there's a way for us to be able to filter activities based on the type activity or the number of participants. And as you can see, it describes to you that these are 2 optional parameters that we can provide to filter our activities by. There is a choice of these 7 different types of activities. So you can pass these as values to this query. And you can also choose how many participants you want to include in your activity. /filter is the endpoint, and it even gives you an example of how you might structure this request. As a challenge, I want you to hit up this endpoint to filter activities, and I want you to filter through the activities to find all of the activities that are social for 2 people. Pause the video, open up Postman, and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, let's open up a new tab and let's put in firstly the base URL, and then we can add in our endpoint, which is /filter. Notice how Postman has a really handy section where you can actually add in your query parameters by key and value, and they will format your URL for you. If we do the first one, which is the type of activity, and we want to set it to social, you can see as I type my key value pairs, it's already formatting my URL for me. Now, however, if you're writing a backend code or if you have to write this yourself, you don't get this neat little feature. So we should practice how we can structure the URL by ourselves. As I mentioned before, the first query comes after the question mark, and every subsequent query has to come after an ampersand or the and symbol. Now, the next one we want to do is called participants. Notice the S, and as always, you have to study the documentation in order to know how to use the API. So this, in our case, is plural. So participants equals 2. And now we've got our 2 queries both set up, even though they're both optional. But once we go ahead and hit send, hopefully we'll get back all the activities that are both social and set up for 2 people. The very last structure that I want you to be familiar with is something called path parameters. So after the base URL, normally comes the endpoint. But an endpoint is usually a fixed path. So it'll be /random. And that endpoint is never going to change. It's always going to be /random spelled in this way. But we can also have something called path parameters, where after a /, we can add some sort of parameter that does change. And this is usually to find some specific resource that exists. So it could be an ID, it could be a username. It's basically something that's very specific that can identify a resource in the API. Unlike query parameters, where it could be multiple things like participants. Well, there were lots of activities with different types of participants, or we had the type. And so I want you to think about query parameters as more for filtering and searching, and path parameters more for identifying a resource by some specific parameter. And we can test this out in our last exercise. So notice that when we look at all the activities that we get back, they all have a unique key. And there's usually some sort of ID or key for each resource where it identifies it uniquely. So there is no other activity with this key or with this ID. And we can use the path parameter, the key, in order to retrieve a specific activity. Now, for example, if on your website you know that you want to always display to the user the first activity as Learn Express.js, then you can simply retrieve it by identifying its specific key. For example, I already know the key for hosting a movie marathon, and it's 5914292. Let's provide this key as a path parameter to query for this specific activity. So let's open up a new tab and let's structure our request. So first part is the base URL. Next comes the endpoint, which in this case is /activity. So that's the route we're going to hit up using our GET request. And then afterwards, after a /, we can specify our unique path parameter. So that's going to go straight into the URL, and it was that number that I told you. So now when I hit send, it's going to look through the database of activities and try to match this key to a specific resource. And once it's found it, it pulls up the entire activity and sends it back to us. And so now we've identified this activity, we've used a GET request to get hold of it, and we use the path parameter to do this. So those are some of the different ways that we can structure our API requests. We've learned about endpoints, we've learned about query parameters, and we've also learned about path parameters. In the next lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about the structure of the data that comes back from an API request. And when it comes to web APIs, the format is usually a JSON. So we're going to learn all about that, what it is, and how to use it in our code. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. So in the last lesson, we saw that when we made a request to our API and when we got our data back, that it came back in the format of a JSON. So who is JSON? Unfortunately, it's not this JSON. The better question is actually, what is JSON? And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So what is it? It's a way to format data that can be sent over the internet in a readable but also efficient way. And as the name suggests, it's structured after a JavaScript object. So we've seen previously that you can create JavaScript objects with key and value pairs. You separate them with a colon, and you can have multiple properties in each object simply by adding a comma after each line. You can also have arrays inside your object, and you can nest an object inside another object. And it's just a really good way for us to be able to structure complex pieces of data. Now, if you compare this JavaScript object with a JSON, you can see it looks pretty much identical. The structure is completely the same. The only thing that changes is the keys, instead of being a JavaScript key, which doesn't actually need any quotes around it at all, it's now turned into a string. So every key is a string, and the value can be strings, it could be numbers, it could be arrays, and it could be any of those things. And once a JSON is laid out properly like this, you can see it's very readable and it's easy to understand that in terms of Jack Bauer's education, he actually has 2 degrees, one from UCLA and one from UC Berkeley. So the key difference is that a JSON is serialized into a string, as for most of the cases, when you're encountering JSONs, it's because some piece of data is being transferred across the internet. Whereas a JavaScript object has a much more relaxed kind of notation because it can be interpreted by the editor or by the code interpreter. And the idea is, let's say you go to your favorite furniture store and you want to buy a wardrobe for your bedroom. Now, that wardrobe would probably be structured like this if it was, in fact, a JavaScript object. So it would have the number of doors specified as properties, number of drawers, and color. And this is a very so probably by the editor or by the code interpreter. And the idea is, let's say you go to your favorite furniture store and you want to buy a wardrobe for your bedroom. Now, that wardrobe would probably be structured like this if it was, in fact, a JavaScript object. So it would have the number of doors specified as properties, number of drawers, and color. And this is a very simple JavaScript object. Now, what if you wanted to move that wardrobe to your house and you want to go from the furniture store to your house? Well, it's not that easy to tie a big wardrobe to the roof of your car. I've tried that. Don't do that. But it is much easier if that wardrobe came in a flat pack. It is a big wardrobe to the furniture. What if you wanted to move that wardrobe to your house and you want to go from the furniture store to your house? Well, it's not that easy to tie a big wardrobe to the roof of your car. I've tried that. Don't do that. But it is much easier if that wardrobe came in a flat pack. So it could be reduced down to its minimal size without all of that air in the middle, so you don't have to transfer a large object. That is the genius behind IKEA. Also, you reduce down. If you wanted to move that wardrobe to your house and you want to go from the furniture store to your house. House. Well, it's not that easy to tie a big wardrobe to the roof of your car. I've tried that. Don't do that. But it is much easier if that wardrobe came in a flat pack. So it could be reduced down to its minimal size without all of that air in the middle, so you don't have to transfer a large object. That is the genius behind IKEA. But also, it's the genius behind JSONs, because instead of that large JavaScript object, we now have a flat pack in the form of a JSON. It is a string from the beginning to the end, and every single aspect of that notation is serialized so that it can be its minimal size when transferred across the internet. The syntax keeps all of the meaning, and then when it gets transferred to the other side and when it needs to be used, it can then be re-expanded into a usable format such as a JavaScript object. When you get a complex JSON sent to you, it's usually in a format that's really difficult to read as a human because it's in its Flatpak notation. And so to make it more human readable, you can use something called a JSON visualizer. And one that I recommend that's free to use on the internet is at jsonviewer.stack.hu. And you can simply paste in your JSON as text, and then you can go to the Viewer tab to view it in a way that's more human intuitive. So you can see this JSON has 3 objects in the initial array. This is a JSON that represents 3 recipes for different types of tacos: chicken taco, beef taco, and fish taco. And within each of the recipes, you can then expand the ingredients to see the protein, the salsa, and the toppings. Now, the toppings is further subdivided into different objects in the array. We've got lettuce, you've got cheese, and you've got guacamole and sour cream. And you can see how this kind of deep nesting makes a lot more sense when we can expand and contract using a JSON viewer. But when it's simply flat packed, like how it would be transferred, then it's really difficult to see exactly what's going on as a human. Although maybe you have more superpowers than I do and this makes total sense to you, but for most of us, this is a lot easier to understand and visualize. When you're writing code and you want to send a JSON across the internet for some reason, you will need to perform what's called serialization, turning a JavaScript object, your big wardrobe, into a JSON, into a Flatpak. And the way you do this with code is using a method from the JSON module. And you will write something like this: JSON.stringify, and then in here you put your JavaScript object. And what it's going to do is essentially that flat packing process. It's going to make this JavaScript object into a string, but a string that has kept all of the commas and quotes and colons to be able to represent all of the different nesting and relationships in that object. Now, the opposite direction, when you want to unpack a JSON, when you are back home and you've got your Flatpak and you're ready to assemble your wardrobe, this process is done using another JSON method, which is called parse. And inside here is where you put your JSON. And once you run the parse method, it turns this JSON back into a JavaScript object. So you can handle it just as you would with any other JavaScript object. You can write something like data.ingredients, and then you would be able to access that property, just as if it was a normal JavaScript object. Let's practice some of this in an exercise. Download the zip file from this current lesson, 5.2 json.zip. And once you've extracted and open it inside VS Code, you'll see that I've included the recipe I showed you earlier in the format of a complex, deeply nested JSON. This is what you would see if you go into the recipe.json. And again, you can copy it and put it into the JSON viewer to be able to see its structure a little bit better. But you can also see it in its really Flatpak condensed format if you go into the index.js. And you can see the recipe JSON simply as one long string, taking up very little space and, as you can imagine, easily transferred across the internet. The challenge for you is to build a website where we use this JSON data to show people how to make these different types of tacos. So the website's called Taco Town, and the first thing I want you to do is to cd into your project folder and then build the node modules using the npm install command. Once you have done that, I want you to go ahead and use nodemon to run the solution.js file. and then you can see it in localhost. You can see we've got this beautiful Mexican website where we can teach people how to make different types of tacos. You can pick your favorite taco ingredient, mine is fish, and it'll show you what goes into a fish taco with all of the ingredients laid out. This is the end result that we're trying to build, and we're doing this by utilizing that complex JSON that we've got in here called recipe JSON. So I'm going to go through each of the steps one by one to complete this challenge. First step, hopefully you've already done, take a look at what the final solution looks like. Don't look inside the solution.js or solution.ejs because those are the answers. Instead, use the index.ejs and index.js files. But in order to complete the challenge, we need to use some of that knowledge we learned about JSONs and some of the tools that we've learned for how to deal with JSONs. So once you familiarize with the structure of the JSON, the goal is to write some code in the app.post so that you can make this website behave like the solution website. So what happens when I click on each of these buttons is we get a post request being sent to the recipe route right here, and it'll be caught within these curly braces. Now you have to think about what to do when that request comes through and how to handle it, because depending on the button that the user pressed, it will have a different value being sent over, which you can access by using the body parser middleware. Hopefully this is all familiar to you. If you've skipped some of the previous modules on EJS and Express, then this might seem confusing, so go back there and make sure you've completed those lessons. And have a think about what you need to do in order to process the request that comes through and how to grab the necessary pieces of data from the recipe JSON and how you can send it over to your index.ejs. Now, once the data gets sent in here, you need to figure out if there is data being sent over, then show all of the ingredients, but otherwise just show an H2 that tells people to pick from one of the options. Now, in the ingredients list, we're going to need to show people the protein name, the protein preparation, the salsa name, and every other topping. And remember, if you look inside the JSON, you can see this is the protein name, protein preparation, salsa, and then the toppings are a series of items inside an array. You need to be pretty familiar with how to work with JavaScript arrays, how to work with JSONs, how to turn a JSON into a JavaScript object so that you can send it over here and process it. But essentially, this is the final outcome you're trying to achieve. And I recommend coming back here frequently to figure out if your version matches the final version. And just in case you're interested, which I'm sure a lot of you are, this beautiful Mexican background I got by going to pattern.monster, where you can generate different patterns in CSS or SVG for use in your website backgrounds. And I simply searched for a Mexican background and simply randomized it until I found one that I liked, and I copied the CSS in order to use in the main.css. That's the challenge. Pause the video, give this a go now.
Udah bisa nih. Chicken. Oh, berarti benar ya, benar ya. Oke, sampai sini benar.
All right, let's run through the solution together. The first thing that we needed to do was to review what the solution looked like, review what the JSON is structured like, and then we can go ahead and complete the app.post. When we get a post request, we're able to tap into the request.body because we're using the body parser middleware. And what gets sent over is the choice that the user made when they clicked on one of these buttons. You get something that has a key of choice and a value of whichever one of these buttons they clicked on, chicken, beef, or fish. So using that knowledge, we can simply write a JavaScript switch statement to check which choice they made. Is it chicken, beef, or fish? And then we can send over the relevant piece of data. If we take a look at the structure of our data, we can view it in the JSON viewer. You can see that there are 3 objects that we can get hold of, and each representing a different recipe, chicken, beef, or fish. All we need to do in our post request recipe, chicken,
Okay, cool.
beef, or fish. All we need to do in our post request is to parse that JSON. Remember, this is the process where we can turn our Flatpak JSON into an actual piece of JavaScript object, which is, in our case, the full wardrobe. We put the recipe JSON in here, which could be from a third-party API. For simplicity's sake, I've simply included it here as a constant, so we don't have to deal with the requests that we're going to learn about in the coming lessons. But once we get hold of the simplicity's sake, I've simply in here wardrobe script object JSON. All we each representing a different recipe, chicken, beef, or fish. All we need to do in our post request is to parse that JSON. Remember, this is the process where we can turn our Flatpak JSON into an actual piece of JavaScript object, which is, in our case, the full wardrobe. We put the recipe JSON in here, which could be from a third-party API. For simplicity's sake, I've simply included it here as a constant, so we don't have to deal with the requests that we're going to learn about in the coming lessons. But once we get hold of our JSON, we pass it into a JavaScript object, and then depending on the choice the user made, we pick the item out of that JSON, just as if it were items in a JavaScript array. And then we set that data, and we send it over when we render our EJS file. At the bottom here, we've got our res.redirect, which is going to go into the app.get, and it's going to send over the data under the key of recipe. And then going into our EJS file data, under the key of recipe. And then going into our EJS file, we can pick up that recipe and check to see if it exists. If it does exist, we're going to show the recipe name and all the ingredients, but otherwise, we're simply going to show them this H2 that asks them to pick one of the buttons. This comes from our EJS knowledge, and more importantly, we're passing the data that we're getting hold of from that recipe in order to include it in different parts of our ingredients. If we zoom in on one of these items that gets sent over, we know that when I click on this chicken button, it's going to send over the chicken recipe in its entirety. And this is essentially the recipe object. So if we tap into recipe.name, we'll be able to get the chicken taco name, which goes into the H2. And in the ingredients list, the first thing we wanted was the protein and the protein preparation. So if we zoom in on the ingredients, we've got the protein, got the name and preparation. This first list item consists of recipe.ingredients.protein.name. And that is how we managed to go from recipe, which is what gets sent over to the EJS file, to ingredients, from ingredients to protein, from protein to name, and also to preparation. So recipe.ingredients.protein.name is how we can get hold of this piece of data. And because we sent over our JavaScript object, we can drill down through the object exactly like so. That's how we dealt with the protein name, protein preparation, and then we have our salsa name, and then we can use a for each loop in order to loop through each of the toppings. Because notice here, denoted by this little different symbol, this is not an object, this is an array of objects. We can loop through each of the toppings and get hold of the quantity and name so that we can display it here, 1 cup of lettuce, half a cup of cheese. By looping through each of the toppings, we can create a li for the topping quantity and the topping name. If this part was what tripped you up or was difficult, then be sure to review the EJS module where we went into this in a lot more detail. But hopefully, with a lot of hard work and perseverance, you managed to get your website to work, and you now have a taco.
Okay, I got it. Invalid JSON. Kok invalid JSON? Kok invalid, Cak?
You can see that there are data relevant piece. It can be beef or fish, and then we can send over the relevant piece of data. If we take a look at the structure of our data, we can view it in the JSON viewer. You can see that there are 3 objects that we can get hold of, and each representing a different recipe, chicken, beef, or fish. We can get hold of
Kok bisa sih anjing?
in the JSON viewer, the structure of our
Oh, case chicken. Lihat.
data. You pass that JSON. Remember, this act in our speech request that we're going to learn about a job, pick up that recipe and check to see if it exists. If it does exist, we're going to show the recipe name and all the ingredients, but otherwise, we're simply going to show them this H2 that asks them to pick one of the buttons.
It's kok nggak ada? preparation, preparation, kok nggak ada sih? Recipe, ingredient, protein. Kok nggak ada? Aduh, salah tekan lagi anjing. Ganggu aja lah X. Cok, ganggu bet cok nih adnya. Protein. Kok nggak ada sih? Ready and dot ingredients. Salah di mana ya? Anjing. Salah di recipe, ingredients, salsa, nggak ini. Oke, di sini every order topping ini pakai each up for each. Gimana cara pakai for each? Recipe dot ingredients terus toppings for each. Hmm, Nah. Hai.
This comes from our EJS knowledge. And more importantly, we're passing the data that we're getting hold of from that recipe in order to include it in different parts of our ingredients. If we zoom in on one of these items that gets sent over, we know that when I click on this chicken button, it's going to send over the chicken recipe in its entirety. And this is essentially the recipe object. So if we tap into recipe.name, we'll be able to get the chicken taco name, which goes into the H2. And in the ingredients list, the first thing we wanted was the protein and the protein preparation. So if we zoom in on the ingredients, we've got the protein, got the name and preparation. This first list item consists of recipe.ingredients.protein.name. And that is how we managed to go from recipe, which is what gets sent over to the EJS file, to ingredients, from ingredients to protein, from protein to name, and also to preparation. So recipe.ingredients.protein.name is how we can get hold of this piece of data. And because we sent over our JavaScript object, we can drill down through the object exactly like so. That's how we dealt with the protein name, protein preparation, and then we have our salsa name, and then we can use a for each loop in order to loop through each of the toppings. Because notice here, denoted by this little different symbol, this is not an object, this is an array of objects. We can loop through each of the toppings and get hold of the quantity and name so that we can display it here, 1 cup of lettuce, half a cup of cheese. By looping through each of the toppings, we can create a LI for the topping quantity and the topping name. If this part was what tripped you up or was difficult, then be sure to review the EJS module where we went into this in a lot more detail. But hopefully, with a lot of hard work and perseverance, you managed to get your website to work, and you now have a Taco Town website. And hopefully in the process, you've learned a bit more about how to view JSONs, how to convert JSONs into a format that we can use and pass around in our code, and how to drill through the JSON for the relevant pieces of information that you want to display. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking more about how to make requests from our server side to an external API so that we can interact with third-party APIs straight from our server backend. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.
Duh, aku nggak mau ya. Telur, telur. Tadi. Tuh. Action Minute API Authentication Source API Scope Projects. Ah, capstone itu apa sih artinya? Uh, uh, the fuck? Belajar sampai jam berapa ya? Lanjut atau udahan guys? Lanjut atau udahan? Lanjut atau udahan? Lanjut atau udahan? Haruskah lanjut atau udah ya?